I never thought at 69 I'd be sitting in an empty house, staring at toys scattered across my living room floor that would never be played with again. Yesterday, Derek walked into my kitchen where I was making Tommy's favourite chocolate chip cookies, and handed me papers that said I was unfit to care for my own grandchildren. 69 years of life, 43 years of marriage, 30 years raising two children as a widow, and 3 years being the only mother Ellie and Tommy remembered after their mama died. All of it suddenly meant nothing. It's for the best. Mom, Derek said, his voice steady as if he were discussing the weather forecast. Rachel stood behind him, her smile sharp as winter frost. But what Derek doesn't know yet is that sometimes the quietest people make the loudest statements. How far would you go to protect the people you love most? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning. Light filtered through the lace curtains my grandmother had sewn 70 years ago, casting familiar patterns across the wide pine floors of the Wills farmhouse. I'd walk these same floorboards every morning for the past 43 years, first as a young bride, then as a widow, and finally as the grandmother who'd promised a dying woman I'd never let her babies feel alone. Sarah's recipe box sat open. On the kitchen counter, its faded blue paint chipped from decades of use. I pulled out the card for Tommy's cookies, written in her careful cursive. Extra vanilla. Tommy says it tastes like hugs. The ink had smeared where my tears fell 3 years ago when I first tried to recreate her magic in this kitchen. Now, those same tears threatened again, but for different reasons. The house felt wrong without small feet thundering down the stairs, without Ellie's quiet humming as she drew at the kitchen table, without Tommy's endless questions about why birds fly south and weather clouds of feelings. For 3 years, this place had been alive again after decades of adult silence. Derek had been so overwhelmed after Sarah's funeral, working 16-hour days to escape his grief, that he'd practically moved the children in permanently, just until I figured things out. Mom, he'd said then, I'd understood. Grief makes strangers of us all for a while. I walked through the rooms that had housed for generations of Will's family memories. The parlour where my husband Robert had read bedtime stories to Derek, and his sister Margaret before the accident took him. The sunroom where Sarah had spent her last good days, watching Ellie paint watercolour flowers while Tommy built block towers. The guest bedroom that had become Ellie's room, walls covered with her artwork, crayon forests and pencil portraits of the three of us together. Everything in his house had a story, a memory, a reason for being exactly where it was. The carved wooden horse on the mantel that Robert's father had made. The quilts his mother had stitched during long Vermont winters. The piano where I taught Derek to play for Elise with more enthusiasm than skill. The garden where Sarah had planted herbs and taught Ellie the names of flowers in 3 languages. This wasn't just my home. It was the children's birthright, their connection to roots that ran deeper than the ancient maple trees shading the front porch. Rachel had made it clear she thought all of this was outdated clutter, that the children would be better off. In a modern environment, she wanted Derek to sell the property, use the money for what she called the children's real future, private schools, tennis lessons, college funds managed by financial advisors who'd never met them. I understood her type. I'd met plenty of them during my years as head librarian at the county library. People who measured worth in square footage and stark portfolios, who thought tradition was just another word for inconvenience. Rachel had grown up in one of those sterile suburban houses where nothing had history and everything could be replaced. She couldn't understand why a child might need to sleep in the same room where generations of children had dreamed their dreams. The phone rang, jarring me from my thoughts. Margot Finley's voice crackled through the receiver with its familiar mixture of affection and exasperation. Karines, I just heard from my grandson who works at the courthouse. Derek filed some kind of emergency custody petition yesterday. What the hell is going on over there? Margot had been my friend since college, back when we were both stubborn young women determined to make our marks on the world. She'd become one of Vermont's most respected estate attorneys before retiring 5 years ago to tend her own garden and meddle in other people's business more efficiently. If anyone could help me understand what Derek had done, It would be Margot. He thinks I'm losing my mind, I said, settling into the chair by the window, where I could see Lucy Navarro hanging laundry next door. Rachel's convinced him that I'm too old, too unstable, to something to care for the children anymore. That's horseshit, and we both know it. Margot's language had grown more colourful since retirement. You've got more sense in your little finger than that boy's shown in years. What exactly did those papers say? I read her the legal language that had shattered my world yesterday. Terms like diminished capacity and emotional instability and potential danger to minor children. Words that painted me as a confused old woman rather than the person who'd been Ellie and Tommy's rock since their mother died. This smells like Rachel's handiwork, Margot said when I finished. She's been pushing Derek toward this for months, hasn't she? She was right. The signs had been there, but I'd chosen to believe in Derek's basic decency. The pointed comments about my episodes when I cried during sad movies. The suggestions that I was overwhelmed when I forgot where I'd put my reading glasses. The way Rachel watched me like a hawk during family dinners, ready to pounce on any sign of confusion or weakness. What hurts most is that Derek knows better, I told Margot. He was here when Sarah made me promise to take care of them. He saw how lost they were after she died, how this house became their safe place again. He knows I'd die before I'd let anything happen to those children. Men get stupid when they're pussy whipped, Margot said bluntly, especially men who've been grieving. Derek's probably so grateful to have someone taking charge that he's not thinking straight. But that doesn't mean we have to let him get away with it. Through the window, I watched Lucy's 5-year-old son Marcus chase their cat around the clothesline. Lucy had moved in next door 2 years ago, fleeing an abusive marriage with nothing but her boy and a suitcase. I'd helped her through those first terrible months with hot meals and babysitting and the kind of practical kindness that doesn't ask questions. She understood what it meant to have your children threatened. Margot, I need to ask you something, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Hypothetically, if someone wanted to make sure their grandchildren were protected, no matter what their parents decided, what would be the best way to do that? The silence stretched long enough that I wondered if we'd lost connection. Then Margot chuckled, a sound like autumn leaves rustling. Hypothetically, of course. Well, hypothetically, there are ways to structure an estate that make certain outcomes very difficult to change. Trusts, for instance, educational funds with specific parameters. Property that can only be inherited under particular circumstances. She paused. But we're just talking hypothetically here. Naturally, you still have that will we drew up 5 years ago. I looked across the kitchen to the oak desk, where Robert had paid bills and balanced checkbooks for decades. The will sat in the top drawer, a document that left everything to Derek and Margaret in equal shares, with provisions for the grandchildren if anything happened to their parents. A simple will for what had seemed like a simple future. I have it good, hypothetically. If someone wanted to revise such a document to reflect changing family circumstances, that person might want to schedule a consultation with a certain retired attorney who's been getting bored with her rose garden. Hypothetically, tomorrow at 10, I'll be there. After I hung up, I sat in the kitchen where I'd fed my family for 4 decades, where I comforted tearful children and celebrated birthdays and holidays and ordinary Tuesday dinners that had been anything but ordinary. The recipe box lay open before me, Sarah's handwriting a bridge between the life I'd known and the life I was about to create. Rachel thought she'd won by taking the children away. She thought I was just a harmless old woman who'd fade quietly into the background of her new family structure. She thought wrong. I pulled out my reading glasses and opened the desk drawer where Robert had kept our important papers, the will, the deed to the house, the bank statements, the investment portfolios I'd built through 40 years of careful saving. Rachel might have legal custody of my grandchildren's present, but she'd forgotten something important. I still controlled their future. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the kitchen in shades of amber and gold. Tomorrow I would begin rewriting the rules of my family's story. Tonight, I would remember every promise I'd made to Sarah, every bedtime story I'd read to Ellie and Tommy, every reason why some battles are worth fighting in silence. Some wars aren't won with lawyers and custody hearings. Some wars are won with patience, planning, and the quiet fury of a woman who's been underestimated her entire life. I closed Sarah's recipe box and began to plan. The custody papers arrived on a Tuesday morning in September, delivered by a sheriff's deputy who looked embarrassed to be standing on my porch. I recognized him, Donnie McAllister, whose mother had been in my book club for 20 years. He'd grown up in this town, attended the library story hours I'd run for decades, married his high school sweetheart in a ceremony where I'd provided flowers from my garden. "Mrs. Wills, I'm real sorry about this," Donnie said, his uniform hat clutched in weathered hands. "I have to serve you with these papers, but I want you to know this doesn't sit right with me at all." I invited him in for coffee because that's what you do in small towns, even when someone's delivering documents that might destroy your life. He sat uncomfortably at my kitchen table, the same table where he'd done homework after school while his mother and I discussed book selections and town gossip. "Have you read them?" I asked, nodding toward the official envelope. "Yes, ma'am, had." T.O., as part of the process, his jaw tightened. "Mrs. Wills, I've known you my whole life. I've seen you with those grandkids. What's written in there? It doesn't match the woman who taught me to love reading, who helped my mama through her cancer treatments, who's been a pillar of this community for longer than most folks have been alive." I opened the envelope with steady hands, though my heart hammered against my ribs. The legal language was cold and clinical, but the accusations cut like glass. Petitioner alleges that respondent has exhibited signs of mental decline, including confusion, emotional outbursts, and inability to maintain appropriate supervision of minor children. Mental decline. I repeated aloud. Emotional outbursts, Donnie shifted in his chair. "Mrs. Wills, is there anything you want to tell me? Anything that might explain why Derek would file something like this?" I thought about the previous week, when Rachel had visited while Derek was traveling for work. She'd found me crying over one of Sarah's old photographs, the one taken at Ellie's 7th birthday party. In it, Sarah was thin from chemotherapy, but radiant with love as she watched her daughter blow out candles on the cake I'd made. It was the last birthday party Sarah would ever attend. Rachel had looked at me with something between pity and disgust. "Kareens, this constant dwelling on the past isn't healthy. The children need stability, not someone who breaks down every time they're reminded of their mother." I tried to explain that remembering Sarah wasn't dwelling, it was honoring her. That children needed to know their mother's stories, her favorite songs, her way of making ordinary moments magical. But Rachel had already made up her mind about what the children needed, and apparently, I wasn't it. "Nothing to explain," I told Donnie. "Unless loving your grandchildren too much has become a crime." He finished his coffee and stood to leave, but paused at the door. "Mrs. Wills, you should know that Derek's been asking questions around town about your health, your ability to manage things. Rachel's been with him sometimes, taking notes." "What kind of questions?" "Whether anyone's noticed you acting confused. If you've had any incidents, any problems." Mrs. Henderson at the grocery store said they asked if you'd ever seemed lost or disoriented while shopping. He looked angry now, as if anyone who's lived in this town for 70 years could get lost between the produce section and the checkout counter. After he left, I sat alone with the papers spread across my table like evidence in a trial I hadn't known I was facing. The petition requested immediate temporary custody, claiming that I posed a clear and present danger to Ellie and Tommy's well-being. It cited specific incidents, the time I'd taken them to the emergency room when Tommy had a fever, which Derek claimed was unnecessary panic over normal childhood illness. The afternoon, I'd called Derek at work because Ellie had fallen from the apple tree and scraped her knee, which became inability to handle minor incidents without emotional distress. Every careful moment of grandmotherly concern had been twisted into evidence of my incompetence. Every tear I'd shed over Sarah's memory became proof of my instability. Every time I'd erred on the side of caution with the children became an example of my unfitness to care for them. The phone rang as I was reading through the accusations for the third time. Derek's voice was strained but determined when I answered. "Mom, I hope you understand this isn't personal. We just want what's best for Ellie and Tommy. What's best for them is staying with the person who's loved them unconditionally since the day they were born. That's not how Rachel sees it. The words slipped out before he could stop them, revealing more than he'd intended. So this is Rachel's decision, not yours. A long pause. It's our decision. As their parents, it's our responsibility to make sure they're in the most stable environment possible. Derek, I raised you in this house. I raised you alone after your father died, and you turned out fine. How is that same house suddenly unsafe for your children? That was different. You were younger then, sharper. Things change, Mum. People ... People get older. The condescension in his voice cut deeper than any legal document could. This was my son, the boy I'd rocked through nightmares and taught to tie his shoes, talking to me like I was a confused stranger who'd wandered into his life by mistake. When is the hearing? I asked, keeping my voice level. Thursday? Mum, if you don't contest this, it'll be easier on everyone. The kids are already settled in with us. Fighting it will just confuse them more. Settled in where? Another pause. Rachel found a house in Burlington. Better schools, more opportunities. We moved them yesterday. The words hit me like a physical blow. While I'd been making Tommy's favorite cookies and planning Ellie's upcoming art project, my grandchildren had been uprooted from the only stable home they'd known since their mother died. Moved to a city 2 hours away, far enough that spontaneous visits would be impossible, that my presence in their lives would become optional rather than essential. You moved them without telling me. We thought it would be easier this way. Clean break, fresh start, for who? For you and Rachel, or for 2 children who just lost another home? Mum, please don't make this harder than it has to be. After he hung up, I walked through my house like a ghost visiting a life that had suddenly become past tense. In Ellie's room, I found a drawing she'd been working on, a picture of the 3 of us standing in my garden. She'd written my family across the top in careful purple letters. Tommy's stuffed elephant sat abandoned on his bed, the one he'd slept with every night since Sarah died. They'd taken my grandchildren, but left their belongings behind, as if their connection to this place could be severed as simply as packing suitcases, as if 3 years of bedtime, stories and scrape-knee comfort and unconditional love could be erased by a change of address. I called Margot, my voice steadier than I felt. The hearing's Thursday. They've already moved the children to Burlington. Bastards. Margot's legal mind was clicking into action. They're trying to establish residency, make it look like the kids are settled in their new environment. Classic manipulation tactic. Can we fight it? We can try, but honey, you need to understand what you're up against. Derek's their father, and he has a new wife who appears stable and financially secure. You're a single woman approaching 70 with no legal standing beyond being their grandmother. Family courts tend to favor parents over grandparents, especially when those parents are making claims about fitness, so I should just give up. Let them disappear into Rachel's perfect suburban life and pretend the last 3 years never happened. I didn't say that. Margot's voice carried a familiar edge. I said fighting in court would be difficult. But there are other ways to fight, Kareens. Other ways to make sure those children know they're loved. Other ways to secure their future. What do you mean? Come see me tomorrow. Bring your financial records, your will, and any documentation you have about the children's care. We're going to explore some hypothetical scenarios. That night, I lay awake in the bed I'd shared with Robert for 23 years, in the house where I'd planned to grow old, surrounded by family. Outside my window, the maple tree that Tommy liked to climb swayed in the September wind, its leaves just beginning to turn the colors that would have delighted Ellie's artist eye. Rachel thought she'd won by taking the children away, she thought. I was just a grieving old woman who'd fade quietly into their past. But she'd made one crucial mistake. She'd underestimated what a mother will do to protect her children, and I'd been more of a mother to Ellie and Tommy than she'd ever been. Sarah had asked me to take care of them, and that promise didn't come with an expiration date or legal limitations. If Derek wanted to play by Rachel's rules, then I'd learn to play by different rules entirely. Rules that had been written by generations of women who'd understood that sometimes the most powerful weapon is patience, and that the most devastating battles are fought in silence. The custody papers lay on my nightstand, but they no longer felt like a defeat. They felt like a declaration of war, and I intended to win. The morning after the custody papers arrived, I found myself standing in what had been Tommy's room, holding his forgotten stuffed elephant. Peanuts, a ridiculous name for an elephant. But Tommy had been 3 when he'd named him, and the logic of 3-year-olds follows different rules. The grey fabric was worn soft from years of bedtime cuddling, and he still smelled faintly of the lavender soap I used to wash his hair. How do you explain to a 7-year-old that the person who's tucked him in every night for 3 years is suddenly too dangerous to see him? How do you explain to a 10-year-old that the grandmother who's helped her process her mother's death is now deemed unfit for her company? I called Derek's new number, the Burlington house that had become my grandchildren's latest address. Rachel answered, her voice bright with artificial cheer. "Oh, Karines, I was wondering when you'd call. The children are doing wonderfully, better than we expected, actually. I think the change of environment is exactly what they needed. I'd like to speak to them. Well, they're quite busy right now. Ellie's in her room doing homework. We've enrolled her in an accelerated program that's much more challenging than what she was getting before. And Tommy's having a play date with a neighbour boy. It's wonderful to see him making new friends so quickly." The message was clear. They were thriving without me, moving on, building a new life where I was unnecessary, but I'd raised children. And I knew the difference between what parents claimed and what children actually felt. When can I see them? A pause. Well, that's complicated right now. With the legal proceedings and everything, Derek's attorney advised us to minimize disruptions to their routine while they adjust. You understand, I understood perfectly. They were using my grandchildren as leverage, ensuring that any attempt to fight the custody decision would be seen as further disruption to children who were supposedly better off without me. Rachel, those children have been my primary responsibility for 3 years. I know when Tommy's upset, he stops eating and has nightmares. I know when Ellie's worried, she draws the same picture over and over until she works through it. You watching for those signs, Karines? I appreciate your concern, but I have a master's degree in child development. I think I can recognize if the children are having adjustment issues. Of course she did. Rachel collected credentials the way some people collected stamps, impressive to display but meaningless without understanding. A degree in child development meant nothing if you didn't understand that Tommy needed his bedtime story read in exactly the same voice every night, or that Ellie processed her emotions through art and needed unlimited access to paper and crayons. After I hung up, I walked to Ellie's room and gathered her artwork from the walls. Drawing after drawing of our life together, the 3 of us picking apples, making cookies, reading in the garden. Pictures of flowers that she'd learned to identify by walking with me through the woods behind our house. A detailed portrait of Sarah that she'd worked on for months, trying to capture every detail of the mother she was afraid of forgetting. Each drawing told a story of connection, of belonging, of a child who'd found stability in her grandmother's love after losing her anchor too young. These weren't the drawings of a child who needed to be protected from me. They were evidence of a bond that Rachel and Derek were systematically destroying. I packed the artwork carefully into a portfolio and drove to Margot's house, a Victorian cottage that she'd filled with law books and rose bushes in equal measure. She was waiting for me with coffee and the kind of blunt assessment I'd learned to expect from 40 years of friendship. "I've been researching Derek's petition," she said without preamble. The accusations are vague enough to be difficult to disprove, but specific enough to paint a concerning picture. Whoever advised them knew exactly what they were doing. Rachel's father is a corporate attorney. She probably had help. That would explain the tactical precision. Margot spread the papers across her dining room table. "Look at this language. Increasingly emotional responses to normal childhood situations. That could describe any grandmother who cares deeply about her grandchildren. Confusion about appropriate boundaries. That could refer to anything from letting them stay up past bedtime to forgetting to pack a lunch. So they've made it impossible for me to defend myself without sounding defensive." Exactly. And the fact that they moved the children before filing means the court will see them as settled in their new environment. Disrupting that setup becomes the burden of proof you'll have to meet. I showed her Ellie's artwork, watching her face change as she studied each piece. Margot had never had children of her own, But she understood love when she saw it documented in crayon and watercolor. These tell a different story, she said quietly. A story of a child who feels safe and cherished. But unfortunately, family. Court judges don't usually accept artwork as evidence of proper care. What can I do? Margot poured more coffee and settled back in her chair, legally. You can contest the custody petition, hire a family attorney, drag this through the courts for months, while the children adjust to their new life and you become increasingly portrayed as the disruptive force trying to unsettle them, even if you won, which is unlikely given Derek's parental rights. The relationship would be poisoned by litigation. Or you accept that Derek has legal custody and focus on what you can control, which is. Margot smiled, the expression sharp as winter. Some light, their future. Rachel and Derek might control where those children live and go to school for the next few years, but you can control what happens to them as adults. You can ensure that their real inheritance, not just money, but this house, this land, their connection to their roots, comes to them directly. Bypassing their parents entirely, she pulled out a legal pad and began sketching what she called estate architecture, trusts that would mature when the children turned 18, educational funds that could only be used for colleges they chose, not ones their parents selected, property transfers that would make me the legal guardian if anything happened to Derek and Rachel. The beauty of this approach is that it's completely legal and virtually impossible to contest. Derek and Rachel would have to prove that you're mentally incompetent to challenge a will or trust you've created with proper legal counsel. Given that you're clearly thinking strategically and making complex financial decisions, that would be difficult, but they'd still have the children for the next 8 years. Yes, but children grow up. Kareens, they form their own opinions. And when Ellie turns 18 and inherits her grandmother's house, the house where she felt safe after her mother died, the house filled with family history and her own artwork, what do you think she remember about who really loved her? That afternoon, I began the careful work of documentation. I photographed every piece of Ellie's art, every note Sarah had written, every indication that my grandchildren had been thriving in my care. I gathered medical records showing that both children had been healthy and well cared for under my supervision. I compiled photos of birthday parties and holidays and ordinary Tuesday afternoons that had been filled with laughter. Lucy Navarro knocked on my door as I was organizing the documents. She stood on my porch with a casserole dish and a worried expression, her son Marcus hiding shyly behind her legs. I heard about what happened, she said. I'm so sorry, those children adored you. They still do. Their parents have just decided. That's not enough. Lucy looked around my living room, taking in the toys still scattered from the last day Ellie and Tommy had played here. Is there anything I can do? Anything at all? I thought about her question as she helped me pack away the children's belongings. Lucy understood what it meant to have your children threatened, to fight for their welfare against people who had more power and resources. She also understood the fierce love that makes women capable of extraordinary things. Actually, there might be, that evening, I called Derek again. This time, he answered. Mom, I hope you're not calling to argue about this. I'm calling to tell you that I won't contest the custody petition. Silence. He'd been prepared for a fight, not a surrender. That's probably for the best. I know this is hard, but I have one condition. Mom, you're not really in a position to make conditions. I want to see them, once a week, supervised if necessary. I want to know they're all right. Another pause. I could hear Rachel's voice in the background, though I couldn't make out the words. I'll talk to Rachel about it. Maybe we can work something out. Derek, I love those children. I would never hurt them. You know that. I know you love them, Mom, but love isn't always enough to keep someone safe. After he hung up, I sat in my kitchen with Sarah's recipe box open beside me. Her handwriting blurred through my tears, but her words remained clear. Promise me you'll take care of them. Promise me they'll always know they're loved. I'd made that promise beside her hospital bed, holding her hand as machines beeped and hope faded. Sarah had known she was dying, and her greatest fear wasn't leaving Derek. It was leaving her children without the fierce, protective love that only mothers understand. Rachel might have legal custody now, but she'd never have what I had with Ellie and Tommy. She'd never be the person they turned to in the middle of the night when nightmares came. She'd never be the one whose voice could calm their fears or whose arms felt like home. And someday, when they were old enough to choose, they would remember who had loved them without conditions, who had fought for them in the quiet ways that mattered most. I closed the recipe box and began planning their future. 3 weeks passed, without word from Derek about visiting arrangements. I called twice, reaching only voicemail, and received one brief text in response, still working on logistics. Kids adjusting well, as if children were houseplants that could be relocated without trauma, as if the bonds formed over 3 years could be severed cleanly with no lasting effects. I knew better. I also knew that pressing too hard would give Rachel ammunition for her narrative about my emotional instability. Instead, I focused on what Margot called strategic patience. I met with her twice a week, learning the intricacies of estate planning and trust law. I discovered that my modest librarian's pension, combined with Robert's life insurance and 40 years of careful saving, had grown into a substantial nest egg. The farmhouse and its 23 acres were worth far more than I'd realized, valued now at nearly $800,000 due to Vermont's real estate boom. "You're not a poor old woman dependent on her children's charity," Margot said. "As we reviewed my financial statements, you're a property owner with significant assets and the legal right to distribute them however you choose. That gives you power, even if Derek and Rachel don't recognize it yet." She helped me draft new will provisions that would leave the house to Ellie and Tommy directly, bypassing Derek entirely. We created educational trusts funded with $200,000 each, money that could only be used for college expenses or vocational training the children chose themselves. Most importantly, we established a provision that if Derek or Rachel tried to sell any inherited property before the children turned 25, ownership would transfer immediately to a conservation trust I'd established with the Nature Conservancy. "The beauty of this structure," Margot explained, "is that it makes the property essentially worthless to Derek and Rachel while preserving it for your grandchildren. They can't sell it, they can't develop it, and they can't use it as collateral for loans, but Ellie and Tommy will inherit a fully paid-off home with a guarantee that it will remain in their family forever." The work gave me purpose during days that felt hollow without children's voices filling the house. I researched conservation easements and scholarship funds, learning a new vocabulary of legal terms that could protect what mattered most. I also began documenting everything I could remember about Sarah's wishes for her children, creating a written record of promises and conversations that might matter someday. On a cold October morning, Lucy knocked on my door with Marcus and a proposal. That surprised me. "I've been thinking about what you said, about whether there was anything I could do to help," she said, settling Marcus at my kitchen table with coloring books. "I want to offer you something." She explained that she'd been considering daycare options for Marcus, who would start kindergarten the following year. The nearest quality program was 40 minutes away and expensive beyond her budget. But if I were interested in watching him a few days a week, along with maybe 1 or 2 other local children, she could pay me what she would have spent on daycare while giving me something to fill the empty hours. "I know it's not the same as having Ellie and Tommy here," she said carefully. "But maybe having children in the house again would help. And maybe it would also show Derek that you're not the isolated, declining woman Rachel's painted you as." The idea intrigued me more than I'd expected. I'd spent 30 years helping parents find books for their children, watching families grow and change through our library programs. I knew how to create safe, nurturing environments for children. More than that, I missed the daily rhythm of caring for small people who needed snacks and stories and someone to listen to their important observations about clouds and caterpillars. Within 2 weeks, Lucy had found other parents interested in my services, a nurse who worked 3 12-hour shifts and needed care for her 4-year-old daughter, and a single father whose mother had been watching his son, but was recovering from hip surgery. Suddenly, my quiet house was alive again with the sounds of children playing, the negotiations over toys and snacks, the endless questions that made every day an adventure. Marcus reminded me of Tommy in some ways. Both were active boys who processed the world through constant motion and chatter. But watching him also made me ache for my grandson, wonder whether Tommy was sleeping well in his new room, whether anyone was reading him the bedtime stories that helped him settle into sleep. The other children brought their own personalities and needs. Emma, the nurse's daughter, was serious and careful like Ellie, preferring books and puzzles to rougher play. 5-year-old Jake was dealing with his parents' divorce and sometimes needed extra patience when his emotions overwhelmed his words. All of them needed what I'd always been good at providing: steady attention, gentle guidance, and the security that comes from knowing someone cares about your well-being. Word spread quickly in our small town. By November, I had a waiting list of parents seeking what they called Karen's old-fashioned childcare, care that included homemade snacks, nature walks, story time, and the kind of attention that was becoming rare and busy to career families. The irony wasn't lost on me. While Derek and Rachel claimed I was unfit to care for my own grandchildren, other parents were seeking me out specifically because of my approach to childcare. The income was modest but steady, and more importantly, it gave me something Rachel couldn't argue with: documentation that I was providing quality care to multiple families who trusted me with their children. When Donnie McAllister stopped by one afternoon to check on me, he found me in my backyard with 4 children, teaching them to identify birds by their calls and feeding patterns. Mrs. Wills, I have to say, you don't look like someone who's too old and confused to care for children. That's what I keep trying to tell my son. Donnie watched Emma carefully sketching a blue jay in her nature journal, while Marcus and Jake built a fort from fallen branches. You know, my wife and I have been talking about what happened with Derek. It doesn't sit right with us, the way those children were just moved away, like they didn't have any say in their own lives. Children rarely do. Unfortunately, maybe not. But they grow up, don't they? And when they do, they remember who was there for them and who wasn't. That same week, I received an unexpected phone call from Ellie's former teacher, Mrs. Patterson. She'd heard about the custody change through the school district's transfer process and was calling to check on me. Mrs. Wills, I want you to know that Ellie was one of my favorite students last year, not just because she was artistic and bright, but because she was so emotionally mature for her age. Do you know what she told me when I asked about her family? What? She said, my mom is in heaven, but my gran takes care of my heart now. That's not something a confused or unstable person teaches a child to say. That's the language of security and love. Mrs. Patterson's words stayed with me as I went through my evening routine of cleaning up toys and preparing for the next day's activities. The house felt alive again, purposeful, but there was still an underlying sadness that no amount of other children's laughter could completely feel. That night, I found myself in what had been Tommy's room, now converted back to a general guest space but still holding traces of his presence. I opened my laptop, a skill I'd learned in my final years as head librarian, and began writing a letter I might never send. Dear Ellie and Tommy, I wrote, I don't know if you'll ever read this, but I need you to know that not a day passes that I don't think about you. I hope you're happy in your new home, that you're making friends and discovering new things too. Love, I hope Rachel is reading you bedtime stories and that Derek is teaching you how to ride bikes and catch fireflies. But I also want you to know that this house still feels like it's waiting for you. Your rooms are here, exactly as you left them. The apple tree Tommy loved to climb is getting ready for winter, and the garden where Ellie painted her flower pictures is sleeping under a blanket of leaves, waiting for spring to wake it up again. Your mama asked me to take care of you, and even though I can't do that the way I used to, I'm still taking care of the things that belong to you. This house, this land, the stories about your family that go back generations, all of that is yours, and it always will be. No one can take that away from you, no matter where you live or what anyone tells you about your past. Someday, when you're older, you'll be able to choose where you want to spend your time and who you want in your lives. When that day comes, I'll be here, just like I always have been. The porch light will be on, there will be cookies in the kitchen, and all the love I've saved up for you will be waiting. I saved the letter in a folder on my computer labeled for later and closed the laptop. Outside my window, the mountains that had watched over 5 generations of Will's family members stood sentinel against the star-filled sky. This land had seen children grow up and move away, had welcomed them back as adults with children of their own, had provided a constant anchor in the changing currents of family life. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Rachel might have temporary custody of my grandchildren, but she couldn't own their heritage. She couldn't claim the stories told around this kitchen table or the memories embedded in every room of this house. She couldn't erase the foundation of love that Sarah and I had built for Ellie and Tommy during their most vulnerable years. Time was on my side now. Every day that passed was a day closer to my grandchildren reaching the age where they could make their own choices about family relationships. Every month was a month closer to the trust I was establishing reaching maturity. Every year was a year closer to the moment when Ellie and Tommy would understand the difference between parents who provided for them and a grandmother who had cherished them. I was learning to play a longer game than Rachel had anticipated, and I was very good at being patient. The letter arrived on a Thursday in late November, mixed in with my usual bills and advertisements. I almost missed it entirely. A small envelope addressed in handwriting I didn't recognize, with no return address. Inside, I found a single sheet of paper and a smaller, sealed envelope that made my heart stop. The handwritten note was brief. Mrs. Wills, I found this among my sister's things when I was cleaning out her apartment. I thought you should have it. Janet Morrison. Janet Morrison. Sarah's sister, who lived in California and had attended the funeral but kept in touch sporadically since then. I stared at the smaller envelope, recognizing Sarah's careful handwriting, for Kareens, to be opened if the children are ever taken from you. My hand shook as I opened it, sitting at my kitchen table in the same chair where Sarah had written these words during her final weeks. The letter was dated just 2 months before she died. Written in the deliberate script of someone fighting exhaustion and medication to get important thoughts onto paper. My dearest Kareens, it began, if you're reading this, then something has gone terribly wrong with Derek's judgment, and I need you to know some things that might help you understand why. Derek has always been easily influenced by strong personalities, ever since he was a child. Remember how he'd change his opinions about everything from favorite foods to career plans depending on who he was trying to impress? I fell in love with his sweetness, his desire to make everyone happy. But I also worried about what would happen if someone with selfish motives got their hooks into him. I've been watching Rachel at the grief counseling sessions, and she scares me, Kareens. She presents herself as this caring, empathetic person, but there's something calculating underneath. She asks too many questions about our finances, our property, Derek's inheritance prospects. She's made comments about how old-fashioned your parenting style is, how the children would benefit from more modern guidance. I've tried to talk to Derek about my concerns, but he just gets defensive. He says I'm being unfair because I'm protective of my children and don't want to share them. He doesn't understand that my worrying isn't about sharing. It's about losing them to someone who sees them as accessories to the life she wants rather than people to be cherished. If something happens to me, when something happens to me, Rachel will push Derek to gain full control over the children. She convince him that you're too old to set in your ways, too emotionally attached to their mother's memory. She make him believe that breaking their connection to you is necessary for their healing. Derek doesn't understand that children don't heal by forgetting. They heal by being held steady while they remember. You know this. You've helped our babies process their grief in ways that honor their mother while helping them feel safe in the world. Rachel sees their connection to Sarah as an obstacle to overcome rather than a treasure to preserve. I need you to know that if the children are ever taken from your care, it won't be because Derek suddenly realized you were unfit. It will be because Rachel convinced him that loving you was somehow betraying her, that choosing his new family meant abandoning his old one. There's something else you should know. Last week, Rachel suggested that we should have you evaluated to make sure you're capable of caring for the children long term. She made it sound like a reasonable precaution, but the way she said it made my stomach turn. She's already planning to remove you from their lives, Kareens. She's just waiting for me to die so she can do it without opposition. I've hidden copies of this letter in 3 places, one with Janet, one in my jewelry box that Derek doesn't know about, and one in the children's baby books. If you're reading this, then my worst fears have come true, and you need to know that what happened wasn't about your fitness as a caregiver. It was about Rachel's need to control every aspect of her new family's narrative. Fight for them, Karens. Not just in court. You and I both know that Derek's parental rights make that an uphill battle. Fight for them the way women in our family have always fought when the obvious paths were blocked. Be smarter than the people trying to defeat you. Be more patient, be more strategic. Most importantly, document everything. Rachel will try to isolate the children from their past, but she can't erase what you preserve. Keep their artwork, their photos, their connection to this house and this land. Someday, when they're old enough to ask questions, they'll need proof that they were loved completely before they were taken away. I wish I could be there to help you through this. I wish I could protect my children from the choices Derek might make when grief clouds his judgment. But I trust you, Karens. I trust you to love them enough to play the long game, to wait for the moment when they can choose their own relationships with their family. Tell them about me. Whenever you get the chance, tell them about the woman who loved them fiercely and wanted them to grow up rooted in family history and unconditional love. Tell them that their mother's dying wish was for them to always know they belong somewhere, to someone who would love them no matter what. With all my love and faith in your strength, Sarah P.S. Check the attic above their bedroom. I hid something there for them that Rachel doesn't know about. I read the letter 3 times, each pass revealing new layers of Sarah's insight and foresight. She'd seen through Rachel's facade from the beginning, understood the calculated nature of her pursuit of Derek, predicted almost exactly how the custody battle would unfold. More than that, she trusted me to be strong enough and smart enough to fight a war she knew was coming. The postscript sent me immediately to the ladder in my hallway closet. I hadn't been in the attic above the children's rooms since the previous spring when I'd stored their winter clothes. The space was dusty and cramped, filled with boxes of Christmas decorations and outgrown furniture. But I found what Sarah had hidden, a waterproof plastic container tucked behind the insulation near the back wall. Inside, I discovered treasures that made me gasp aloud. Sarah's journal from her final months, filled with letters to Ellie and Tommy for birthdays and milestones she wouldn't live to see. A video camera with dozens of recordings, Sarah reading bedtime stories, singing lullabies, telling family stories about grandparents and great-grandparents the children had never met. Photo albums documenting every stage of their young lives, with Sarah's commentary written in margins. Tommy's first word was cookie. He said it right here in Gran's kitchen. Ellie painted this picture after we walked in the woods. She said the trees were whispering secrets to each other. The most precious discovery was a sealed envelope addressed to me, containing keys and a safety deposit box number at the local bank. Sarah's final insurance policy, evidence of her deliberate planning to protect her children's future, even from the grave. At the bank the next morning, I discovered that Sarah had deposited additional funds into accounts designated for her children's education, money that Derek knew nothing about. She'd also stored copies of legal documents, including her original will and detailed instructions about her wishes for the children's upbringing. Most importantly, she'd written a letter to be given to Ellie and Tommy when they turned 18, explaining her love for them and her trust in their grandmother's care. I never wanted them to be taken from the person who loves them most. The letter concluded, if that happened, it wasn't because I approved of it or because you weren't the perfect grandmother I knew you'd be. It was because grief makes people vulnerable to manipulation, and love sometimes isn't enough to protect against calculated selfishness. The discovery changed everything. Sarah's letter wasn't just emotional support. It was evidence that Derek's decision had been influenced by someone with ulterior motives, someone who'd been planning to separate the children from me since before their mother died. More than that, it was proof that Sarah had trusted me enough to create backup plans, hidden resources, legal documentation that could matter when the children were old enough to understand. I called Margot immediately, my voice steady with new purpose. I need to show you something. Sarah knew this was going to happen. Margot listened in silence as I read both letters aloud, her expression growing grimmer with each paragraph. When I finished, she sat back in her chair and swore with the creativity of someone who'd spent 40 years dealing with family betrayals. "That calculating bitch," she said finally. Sarah called it perfectly. Rachel was playing a long game from the beginning, and Derek was too grief-stricken and too flattered by her attention to see it. What does this change legally, on its own? Nothing. These letters don't prove that Derek was coerced or that he's unfit as a parent. They're not admissible in custody proceedings, and they don't give you any additional legal standing. Margot paused, her lawyer's mind working through implications. But they change the narrative. Karines, they prove that your removal from the children's lives wasn't based on any real concern for their welfare. It was the result of a calculated campaign by someone who wanted you out of the way. For what purpose? Control, money, status. Rachel gets the perfect family she's designed. Derek gets a wife who manages all the difficult decisions. And the children get molded into whatever image fits Rachel's idea of success. Your influence, your insistence on honoring their mother's memory, your old-fashioned values, your deep emotional connection to them, all of that threatens the clean slate she wants to create. That afternoon, I began a new phase of documentation. I transcribed Sarah's letters, copied her video messages, organized her photos and journals into a comprehensive record of her final wishes for her children. I also started researching Rachel's background more thoroughly, using skills I developed as a librarian to trace her family history, her education, her previous relationships. What I found confirmed Sarah's instincts. Rachel had been married briefly in her 20s to a man 15 years older, a marriage that ended in divorce just 2 years after he'd named her as beneficiary on his life insurance policy. She'd pursued Derek with the single-minded focus of someone who knew exactly what she wanted and how to get it. But Sarah's letters had given me something more valuable than ammunition. They'd given me absolution. The guilt I'd carried about losing my grandchildren, the self-doubt about whether I'd somehow failed them, the wondering if Derek might be right about my fitness, all of it dissolved in the face of Sarah's clear-eyed assessment of the situation. I hadn't failed anyone. I'd been outmaneuvered by someone who'd been planning this campaign since before Sarah died. Someone who'd used Derek's grief and desire for stability against him. More importantly, I'd been trusted by the children's mother to fight exactly the kind of fight I was now planning. That evening, I sat in my kitchen with Sarah's recipe box open beside me, reading her letters to her children while snow began to fall outside my window. The house felt different now, not empty and abandoned, but purposeful and patient. I wasn't just waiting for my grandchildren to grow up and choose their own relationships. One was preparing for their return, preserving their heritage, building the foundation they'd need when they were ready to reclaim their true family history. Rachel thought she'd won by taking them away. She thought I was just a grieving old woman who'd fade into irrelevance. But she'd underestimated two things: the determination of a grandmother protecting her cubs, and the foresight of a mother who'd prepared for this battle from beyond the grave. The war was far from over. In fact, thanks to Sarah's gift of insight and documentation, I was just getting started. December arrived with the kind of bitter cold that made Vermont feel like the edge of the world. The children I cared for during the day brought stories of Christmas preparations, excited chatter about Santa and presents, and family gatherings that would happen in warm houses filled with love. Their innocent joy reminded me daily of the holidays I wouldn't share with Ellie and Tommy, the traditions that were being broken or replaced in their new life. But I had work to do, and grief was a luxury I couldn't afford. Margot and I spent hours crafting what she called the architecture of justice, legal structures that would protect my grandchildren's future while documenting the truth about their present. We established multiple trusts, each designed to serve different purposes: education funds that couldn't be touched by their parents, inheritance provisions that required the children to spend significant time at the farmhouse to qualify for ownership, and most importantly, a detailed legal record of Sarah's wishes and my role in fulfilling them. The beauty of this approach, Margot explained as we finalized the documents, is that it's completely legal and virtually unassailable. Derek and Rachel can't contest what they don't know exists. And by the time they discover it, the children will be old enough to make their own decisions about their relationships with everyone involved. but I wanted more than legal protection. I wanted my grandchildren to understand the truth about their family, to have access to their mother's memory, to know that they'd been loved completely, even when they couldn't feel that love directly. That required a different kind of strategy. I began creating what I privately call the Preservation Project, a comprehensive record of Ellie and Tommy's early lives that would survive any attempt to erase their connection to me or their mother. I digitized every photo, every piece of artwork, every home video from their 3 years in my care. I transcribed Sarah's bedtime stories word for word, recording myself reading them so the children would have both their mother's words and my voice when they were old enough to want them. Most importantly, I documented the daily moments that Rachel would dismiss as insignificant, but that I knew formed the foundation of a child's sense of security. Tommy's elaborate bedtime ritual involving 3 different stuffed animals arranged in precise order. Ellie's habit of humming while she drew, the same melody Sarah had hummed while cooking. The way both children automatically reached for my hand when they were scared or uncertain, trusting that I would keep them safe. Lucy Navarro became my unexpected ally in this project. As a mother who'd fled an abusive situation, she understood the importance of preserving truth when powerful people tried to rewrite history. She helped me organize the digital files, create multiple backup copies, and establish secure storage systems that would survive any legal challenges. My ex-husband tried to convince everyone that I was an unfit mother. She told me as we worked late one evening in my kitchen, surrounded by photo albums and computer files. He had lawyers, money, family connections, all the advantages. But I had the truth, and eventually the truth mattered more than his resources. How long did it take? 3 years. 3 years of supervised visitations, court hearings, evaluations that made me feel like a criminal for protecting my son. But Marcus is with me now, and he'll never have to doubt that I fought for him. Lucy's experience gave me hope and realistic expectations. This wouldn't be a quick victory or a dramatic courtroom confrontation. It would be a slow, methodical campaign fought with patience and documentation rather than emotion and confrontation. In January, I received my first communication from Derek in months. A formal letter from Rachel's father's law firm informing me that the children were thriving in their new environment and that further attempts to contact them would be considered harassment and could result in legal action. The message was clear: stay away, stay quiet, disappear from their lives completely. Instead, I increased my efforts. Working with Margot, I hired a private investigator to document Derek and Rachel's life in Burlington. Not to find fault with their parenting. I had no reason to believe they were harming the children, but to gather information about the children's adjustment, their school performance, their social connections. I needed to know whether Rachel's claims about their thriving were accurate or whether the children were struggling in ways their parents might not recognize. The investigators' reports painted a complicated picture. Both children were enrolled in expensive private schools and appeared well cared for in material terms. But Tommy had been referred to the school counselor for behavioral issues, difficulty concentrating, occasional outbursts, resistance to authority figures that reminded me of his grief responses after Sarah died. Ellie had stopped participating in art programs despite her obvious talent, and her teachers described her as withdrawn and overly compliant. These weren't signs of abuse, but they were signs of children who were suppressing parts of themselves to fit into their new environment. Children who were grieving losses their parents might not even recognize, not just the loss of their grandmother's daily presence, but the loss of a home where their emotional complexity had been welcomed rather than managed. The reports also revealed information about Derek and Rachel's marriage that surprised me. They were attending couples counseling, dealing with what their therapist notes obtained through carefully legal channels described as integration challenges and disagreements about parenting approaches. Derek had expressed concerns about the children's emotional regression and wondered whether the move had been too abrupt. Rachel had pushed back, insisting that clean breaks were healthier than drawn-out transitions. I shared this information with Margot, who read through the reports with the sharp attention of someone who'd spent decades parsing family dynamics for legal leverage. Derek's having doubts, she said. Not enough to change his mind yet, but enough to create cracks in his confidence. Rachel's holding the line, but she's also showing the strain of managing a situation that's more complicated than she expected. What does that mean for us? It means we continue to be patient and document everything. If Derek's marriage to Rachel starts to fracture, if the children's adjustment issues become more pronounced, if Rachel's control starts to slip, any of those factors could create an opening for the children to reconnect with you. And if none of that happens, then we stick to the original plan. The children turn 18 eventually, the trusts mature, they inherit this house and all the documentation we're creating. They get to make their own decisions about their family relationships based on complete information rather than carefully edited narratives. February brought an unexpected development that changed the dynamic significantly. Marcus Navarro, Lucy's son, came home from kindergarten with a story that made my blood run cold. During a playdate at a classmate's house, he'd met a girl who used to live with Mrs. Kerins too. The girl had been visiting with her new family, and when Marcus mentioned my name, she'd burst into tears. The girl was Ellie. According to Marcus's carefully reported conversation, Ellie had asked whether I was still sad about them going away, whether I still lived in the house with the apple tree, whether I missed them. When Marcus assured her that I talked about her and Tommy every day, Ellie had whispered, "Tell her we miss her too." But we're not supposed to say that. Lucy and I discussed this development carefully, both of us aware that we were dealing with sensitive information involving children caught in an adult conflict. But we also agreed that Ellie's message suggested the children were not as settled and content as Derek and Rachel claimed. "She's sending you a signal," Lucy said. "She wants you to know that whatever her parents are telling you about how well they're adjusting, the children remember you and miss you and haven't forgotten the connection you shared." I began sending anonymous cards to the children's schools for their achievements, art shows, academic awards, school performances, nothing that could be traced back to me directly, but small signals that someone who loved them was paying attention to their lives. Through the investigator, I learned that Ellie had asked her teacher who might be sending the cards, suggesting she suspected, but couldn't be sure. These small communications felt like lifelines across the void that Rachel had created. I couldn't speak to my grandchildren directly, couldn't hold them when they had nightmares or celebrate their successes in person. But I could let them know, in subtle ways, that they hadn't been forgotten, that someone who'd loved them before they were taken away was still loving them from a distance. The winter deepened, and I settled into a routine of strategic patience. Days spent caring for other people's children, evenings spent organizing documentation and strengthening legal protections, nights spent writing letters to Ellie and Tommy that they might never read, but that preserved my voice for a future conversation. I was building something that Rachel couldn't destroy because she didn't know it existed, a foundation of truth, love, and legal protection that would support my grandchildren when they were old enough to choose their own version of family. Every document I preserved, every trust I established, every recorded memory I created was a brick in a fortress that would protect what mattered most. The children's right to know their complete story. Spring would come eventually, as it always did in Vermont. The children would grow older, more independent, more capable of asking their own questions about their family history. Derek and Rachel's perfect control would face new challenges as Ellie and Tommy developed their own opinions and relationships. When that time came, I would be ready, not with anger or bitterness, but with love and documentation and legal structures that would give my grandchildren choices their parents had tried to eliminate. The war Rachel had started was far from over, but thanks to Sarah's foresight and my own determination, I was finally fighting on ground I'd chosen, with weapons she couldn't see coming. The phone call came on a rainy March morning that felt like the cusp between winter and spring. Derek's voice was strained, barely controlled, carrying an undertone of panic that I hadn't heard since Sarah's final hospitalization. "Mom, I need to talk to you. Can I come over?" No mention of Rachel, no carefully scripted language about what's best for everyone, just my son, sounding like the frightened boy he'd been when his father died, asking for help in the voice I remember from his childhood. "Of course. I'll put coffee on." He arrived 20 minutes later, driving the expensive SUV Rachel had insisted they needed for their new lifestyle. But he looked haggard, older than his 41 years, wearing the expression of someone who'd discovered that the life he'd built wasn't what he'd thought it was. I poured coffee in the same blue mugs we'd used throughout his childhood, sat across from him at the kitchen table where I'd helped him with homework, and listened to his teenage problems and celebrated his college acceptance. The familiar ritual seemed to calm him slightly, or maybe just reminded him of when his problems had simpler solutions. I think I've made a terrible mistake, he said finally. I waited, letting him find his own words, giving him the space to confess what I'd been hoping he'd realize for months. The kids aren't adjusting the way Rachel said they would. Tommy's having nightmares again, worse than after Sarah died. He keeps asking for you, asking when he can come home. And Ellie ... Derek's voice broke slightly. Ellie barely speaks anymore unless she's spoken to. She draws these pictures of empty rooms and houses with no people in them. How long has this been going on? Months, since we moved them. Rachel keeps saying it's normal, that children need time to adapt to change, that I'm being too emotional about it. But Mum, I remember how they were with you. They were happy. They laughed every day. They felt safe. I kept my expression neutral, fighting the urge to say I told you so or demand explanations for decisions that had hurt us all. Derek was finally seeing what I'd known from the beginning, and I couldn't let my own pain derail this conversation. What changed your mind? Derek rubbed his face with both hands, looking exhausted. Last week, Tommy had one of his nightmares, and when I went to comfort him, he looked at me and said, "Daddy, did Gran die too? Is that why we can't see her anymore?" And I realized, God, Mum, I realized that's what we've done to them. We've made them think you're gone forever, like their mother and Ellie. She found one of Rachel's magazines yesterday, one of those home design things. There was an article about farmhouse kitchens, and Ellie just stared at this picture that looked like yours. When Rachel asked what she was looking at, Ellie said, "This looks like home." Rachel got angry, told her this was her home now, that she needed to stop living in the past. The conversation I'd been waiting for was finally happening, but I found myself feeling more sadness than satisfaction. Derek was realizing the cost of his choices, but the children had already paid the price for his delayed understanding. Derek, what do you want from me? I want to bring them to see you. I want them to know you're still here, still part of their lives. Rachel doesn't agree, but ... double quotes. He paused, seeming to gather courage. But they're my children, and I can see that they need you. What about Rachel? Derek's expression hardened in a way I hadn't seen since he was a teenager asserting his independence. Rachel doesn't get to decide what my children need anymore. I've been letting her make decisions about my family because I was grateful to have someone who seemed to know what she was doing. But she doesn't know Ellie and Tommy the way I do, the way you do. Are you prepared for the consequences of that position? You mean my marriage? Derek laughed bitterly. Rachel's already made it clear that if I don't support her decisions about the children 100%, she have to reconsider our relationship. She sees any questioning of her judgment as betrayal. I thought about the counselling reports, the strain that the investigator had documented, the cracks that had been forming in their relationship as Derek started to doubt the wisdom of isolating his children from their grandmother. Derek, I need you to understand something. If you bring the children here, if you start making decisions that Rachel disagrees with, she's going to fight back. She might try to convince you that I'm manipulating you, that the children are just confused, that rebuilding their relationship with me is harmful to their adjustment. I know. But Mum, I can't watch my children disappear into these polite, quiet versions of themselves just to make my wife comfortable. They used to be so alive when they were with you. The vulnerability in his voice reminded me why I'd always fought for Derek even when he'd made choices I couldn't understand. He wasn't a villain in this story. He was a grief-stricken father who'd been manipulated by someone who understood his weaknesses better than he did. When do you want to bring them? This weekend? Saturday afternoon? I thought maybe we could ... maybe we could make it feel normal. Like a regular visit, I agreed, though we both knew there was nothing regular about a visit that had required months of estrangement and a marital crisis to make possible. After Derek left, I walked through my house seeing it through the children's eyes. wondering how much it had changed in their memories, whether it would still feel like home or like a museum of their former lives. I called Margot to let her know about the development, and she listened with the careful attention of someone who'd been planning for exactly this scenario. This is either the beginning of their return to your life or the last visit before Rachel finds a way to stop them permanently, she said. Either way, you need to be prepared for whatever comes next. What does that mean? It means having all your documentation organized and accessible. It means being ready to provide evidence of the children's well-being during their time with you versus their struggles since leaving. It means preparing for the possibility that this visit triggers a legal battle or a custody fight between Derek and Rachel. Saturday arrived grey and drizzly, typical March weather that couldn't decide whether it was still winter or finally spring. I made Tommy's favourite cookies and set up Ellie's art supplies in her old spot at the kitchen table. I pulled their forgotten toys from storage and placed them casually around the house, trying to make everything look natural rather than staged. When Derek's car pulled into my driveway, I felt a nervousness I hadn't experienced since the first time I'd babysitted as a teenager. Through the kitchen window, I watched him talk to the children in the car, saw Ellie's hesitant nod and Tommy's more enthusiastic response. Then they were at my door, my grandchildren who'd grown taller and more cautious in the months since I'd seen them. Ellie hung back behind her father, studying my face as if trying to reconcile memory with reality. Tommy bounced on his toes with barely contained excitement, but he didn't run to me the way he used to. "Hi, Gran," Ellie said quietly. "Hello, sweetheart." "I've missed you so much," Tommy broke first, launching himself into my arms with the force of pent-up longing. He buried his face against my shoulder and whispered, "I knew you weren't dead." "I told Daddy you weren't dead." Ellie approached more carefully, but when I opened my other arm, she stepped into the embrace and held on tightly. For a moment, we were exactly who we'd always been, grandmother and grandchildren who belonged together. "Can we see our rooms?" Tommy asked when we finally separated. "Of course." "They're exactly the way you left them." I watched them explore their former home with a mixture of familiarity and wonder, touching toys they'd forgotten, examining artwork still hanging on their walls, rediscovering hiding places and favourite corners. In Tommy's room, he found Peanuts the elephant still waiting on his bed and clutched the stuffed animal like a lifeline. Ellie spent a long time in what had been her art corner in the kitchen, running her fingers over supplies I'd kept organised and ready for her return. She pulled out a half-finished drawing from the folder where I'd preserved her work and studied it with the serious concentration I remember. I stopped drawing, she told me quietly. "Why?" "Rachel says art is fine as a hobby, but I should focus on more practical skills." She enrolled me in math tutoring and French lessons instead. The casual way Ellie delivered this information made it more heartbreaking than if she'd complained. She was reporting facts about her new life without judgment, but I could see the loss in her eyes, the creative spark that had been systematically discouraged until it nearly went out. "Would you like to finish this drawing?" Ellie nodded, settling into her chair with the unconscious grace of someone returning to a beloved habit. Within minutes, she was absorbed in her work, humming the melody I remembered, adding details and colours to the picture she'd abandoned months ago. Tommy had found his cache of toy trucks and was constructing an elaborate road system across the living room floor, narrating adventures and sound effects with the imagination that had been muted in his new environment. Derek sat in the rocking chair where I'd comforted both children through countless hurts and fears, watching his children remember who they'd been before careful management had replaced spontaneous love. "They're different," he said quietly. "They're the same children. They've just learned to hide parts of themselves that weren't welcome in their new environment. How do I fix this?" You start by trusting that children know the difference between people who love them and people who want to control them. You listen to what they're telling you, even when they're not using words. We spent the afternoon in careful normalcy, playing games, reading stories, working in the garden that was just beginning to show signs of spring growth. I watched Derek observe his children, seeing them through eyes that were finally clear of Rachel's influence and his own guilt-driven decisions. When it came time to leave, both children clung to me with desperate intensity. "When can we come back?" Tommy asked. "Can we stay longer next time?" Ellie added. Derek looked at me over their heads, his expression resolute in a way I hadn't seen in years. "How about next weekend? How about we make this a regular thing?" The drive home would be difficult. I knew Rachel would be waiting for reports, would be looking for signs that the visit had been harmful or manipulative. Derek would face questions and possibly ultimatums. The children would have to transition back to their carefully managed life while carrying fresh memories of freedom and unconditional acceptance. But something fundamental had shifted during those few hours. Derek had seen his children return to themselves in my presence. He'd witnessed the difference between the cautious, compliant versions of Ellie and Tommy that Rachel preferred and the vibrant, creative, emotionally honest children they became. When they felt safe to be themselves. As I watched their car disappear down my driveway, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: hope. Not just for future visits or legal victories, but for the restoration of relationships that Rachel had tried to destroy. The war wasn't over, but the tide had finally turned. The confrontation came sooner than I'd expected. On Tuesday morning, 3 days after Derek's visit with the children, Rachel arrived at my door alone, her perfectly composed facade cracking at the edges. She stood on my porch in her expensive coat and coordinated accessories, looking like she'd stepped out of a magazine spread about successful suburban mothers. But her eyes held the fury of someone whose carefully constructed world was under threat. "We need to talk." I invited her in because I wanted this conversation on my territory, surrounded by the evidence of my grandchildren's real history. In the kitchen where Sarah had trusted me with her deepest fears about this woman, Rachel declined my offer of coffee, choosing instead to stand near the window with her arms crossed, her posture radiating controlled aggression. Derek told me about his visit here. Against my better judgment, I allowed it because he insisted the children needed closure. But I want to be very clear about boundaries going forward. What boundaries are those? The children are adjusting well to their new life. They're thriving in an environment that challenges them academically and socially. What they don't need is confusion about where they belong or romantic nostalgia about a lifestyle that wasn't preparing them for success. I thought about Ellie's confession that she'd stopped drawing, about Tommy's nightmares and desperate questions about whether I was dead. Is that what you think I provided? Romantic nostalgia? I think you provided the kind of indulgent, overtly emotional environment that felt comfortable in the moment, but didn't teach them resilience or independence. Derek's children need to learn that love means preparing them for the real world, not protecting them from it. Rachel's clinical language revealed everything I needed to know about her approach to parenting. Love was conditional, tied to performance and development. Comfort was weakness. Children were projects to be optimized rather than people to be cherished. Rachel, those children lost their mother when they were 6 and 4 years old. They needed stability and emotional security, not academic acceleration and social networking. They needed to learn that life goes on, that dwelling on loss isn't healthy, that they could build new relationships and new traditions. Rachel's voice grew sharper. What they didn't need was a grandmother who encouraged them to live in the past, who made them think that grieving was more important than growing. I never discouraged them from growing. I encouraged them to grow with their grief intact, to understand that loving their mother's memory didn't prevent them from loving new people. That's exactly the kind of thinking that concerns me. Rachel moved closer to the table, her presence suddenly invasive in my kitchen space. This obsession with their mother, this insistence on preserving every painful memory, this house full of artifacts from a life they've outgrown, it's not healthy for them or for Derek. The accusation hung in the air between us, revealing the real source of Rachel's campaign against me. It wasn't about my fitness as a caregiver or the children's welfare. It was about her need to eliminate Sarah's influence from Derek's life, to erase any reminder that he'd loved someone before her, that his children had a mother whose memory competed with her authority. You want them to forget Sarah. I want them to have room in their hearts for new love without being burdened by grief they're too young to process. I want Derek to build a future with me without constantly being pulled back into a past that can't be changed. There it was, the truth Sarah had intuited during her final weeks. Rachel's campaign against me wasn't about protecting the children. It was about possessing Derek completely, ensuring that his loyalty to her wasn't compromised by competing attachments. Rachel, Those children will always love their mother. That's not a burden, it's a gift. And Derek will always have memories of his life with Sarah. That's not a threat to your marriage. It's part of who he is. Not if they're encouraged to move forward instead of being constantly reminded of what they've lost. Rachel's mask slipped completely, revealing the calculating nature Sarah had recognized. Derek was making real progress in therapy, learning to focus on our future together, until you started manipulating him with guilt about the children's adjustment issues. I didn't manipulate him. He came to me because he could see that his children were struggling. He came to you because you've spent months undermining my parenting, planting seeds of doubt about decisions that were made for the children's benefit. You've been working to sabotage our family from the moment Derek chose to build a life with me. The accusation was so far from the truth that I almost laughed. I'd spent months in strategic silence, building legal protections and preserving memories while deliberately avoiding any direct challenge to Rachel's authority. But she'd interpreted my restraint as manipulation, my patience as scheming. I've been trying to preserve my grandchildren's connection to their family history. If that threatens you, maybe you should ask yourself why. Rachel's expression shifted, becoming coldly practical. I want to make you an offer. What kind of offer? Derek's told me about your will, about leaving this property to the children. I'm prepared to have my father's firm draw up documents that would allow you to transfer ownership to Derek immediately, with provisions for the children's inheritance when they reach adulthood. In exchange, you agree to limit contact with them to holidays and special occasions, under supervision, until they're old enough to understand the complexities of adult relationships. The proposal was breathtaking in its cynicism. Rachel was offering to let me sell my grandchildren's birthright for controlled access to their lives, gambling that I cared more about seeing them occasionally than about preserving their heritage. And if I refuse, then Derek and I will be forced to consider whether any contact with you is in the children's best interest. Courts tend to support parents who can demonstrate that a family member's influence is creating confusion and emotional instability in children who are otherwise thriving. The threat was clear: accept Rachel's terms or lose access to the children entirely. She'd learned from the custody battle that emotional manipulation worked better than legal action, and she was prepared to use Derek's fear of losing his children to force my compliance. I thought about Sarah's letters, about the trust funds I'd established, about the video messages and documented memories that would survive any attempt to erase my influence. I thought about the private investigators' reports showing the children's real struggles, about Tommy's nightmares and Ellie's artistic silence. Most importantly, I thought about the promise I'd made to a dying mother who trusted me to protect her children's right to know they were loved completely. No, Rachel blinked, clearly not expecting such a direct refusal. Excuse me. No, I won't accept limits on my relationship with my grandchildren based on your insecurity about their mother's memory. I won't sell their inheritance to buy your permission to love them. And I won't pretend that your version of their welfare is more important than their actual well-being. You're making a mistake. Karines, Derek will choose his wife and his future over his mother's unreasonable demands. Maybe. But those children will grow up, Rachel. They'll form their own opinions about who love them and who use them. They'll ask questions about their mother, about their early childhood, about why their relationship with their grandmother was suddenly severed when they were too young to understand. I stood and walked to the kitchen counter where Sarah's recipe box sat open, pulling out the letter she'd written for her children to read when they turned 18. Sarah knew this might happen. She knew someone might try to erase her memory from her children's lives, and she prepared for that possibility. When Ellie and Tommy are old enough, they're going to read their mother's own words about what she wanted for them, about who she trusted to preserve their heritage. Rachel's face went pale as I read excerpts from Sarah's letter, her confidence cracking as she realized that her campaign to control the family narrative had been anticipated and countered by the woman she'd tried to replace. You can't prove those letters are authentic. I don't have to. I just have to wait for the children to grow up and decide for themselves what they believe. After Rachel left, I called Margot to report the conversation and the implicit threats. She listened with the satisfaction of someone whose strategic planning was proving its worth. She's desperate, Margot said. That offer to buy the property was a last-ditch attempt to get control of the children's inheritance before they're old enough to claim it themselves. Her threat to cut off contact was her nuclear option, and you called her bluff. What happens? Now we wait. Derek saw his children return to themselves during that visit. Rachel's threats are going to force him to choose between his wife's need for control and his children's obvious happiness. That's not a choice any good father can avoid making. The waiting was hard, but it was different from the helpless grief I'd felt during the early months of separation. I had work to do, documentation to complete, legal structures to strengthen. I also had hope, based on Derek's growing recognition that his children needed more than academic success and social advantage. They needed the kind of unconditional love that doesn't come with conditions or expectations. Spring arrived in earnest, bringing longer days and the kind of April warmth that made Vermont feel like paradise. The children I cared for during the day helped me plant the garden, their excitement about seeds and growth reminding me daily that love invested in children always bears fruit, even when you can't predict the timing of the harvest. On a Saturday, in late April, Derek called with a proposal that changed everything. "Mom, I want to bring the kids for the weekend. Not just an afternoon visit. I want them to spend Saturday night, wake up in their old rooms, remember what it feels like to be here." "What about Rachel?" Rachel and I are. "We're taking some time apart. She's staying with her parents while we figure out whether we can find common ground about the children's needs." The separation didn't surprise me, though I felt sadness for Derek rather than satisfaction about Rachel's departure. He genuinely tried to build a blended family, and the failure of that effort would leave scars regardless of the outcome. "Derek, I want you to know that I never wanted your marriage to fail. I wanted what was best for you and the children." "I know, Mom, and what's best for them includes having you in their lives." I should have trusted that from the beginning. That weekend, Ellie and Tommy returned to my house not as visitors, but as children coming home. They helped me prepare meals from Sarah's recipes, worked in the garden that had been dormant during their absence, created new artwork for the walls that had seemed empty without their creative energy. Most importantly, they talked about their mother, about their memories of living with me, about their struggles in their new environment, and their relief at being able to express their feelings without judgment. "Gran," Ellie said as I tucked her into her old bed Saturday night, "I want to live here again." "Is that okay to want?" "It's absolutely okay to want that, sweetheart. And we're going to work on making that happen," Rachel said, wanting to live here meant I didn't appreciate everything she did for us. Rachel was wrong. Loving this place and wanting to be here doesn't mean you're ungrateful for anything else. It means you know where you feel safe and happy. 6 months later, Derek and the children moved back to the farmhouse. The custody arrangement was informal but permanent. Derek found work in town. Rachel returned to Burlington with a divorce settlement that included none of the family property, and my grandchildren resumed the life that had been interrupted by a woman who'd mistaken control for love. The legal structures I'd built remained in place, ensuring that the children's inheritance was protected regardless of any future changes in family circumstances. But more importantly, the bonds that Rachel had tried to sever were healing, strengthened by the knowledge that they'd survived attempted destruction. On quiet evenings, when homework was finished and bedtime stories had been read, I sometimes found myself in the kitchen with Sarah's recipe box, grateful for the wisdom and foresight that had made this restoration possible. My daughter-in-law had understood that love requires both tenderness and strength, that protecting children sometimes means fighting battles they're too young to fight themselves. I'd kept my promise to Sarah, and my grandchildren were home where they belonged, surrounded by the love that had never wavered. In the house that had always been waiting for their return, the war was over, and love had won. The first time Ellie will step foot on the porch of the farmhouse in nearly a decade, it was spring, and the apple trees were in full bloom, just as they had been in her dreams. The drive from Burlington had taken 3 hours instead of 2. Part of that was traffic, part was indecision. She'd stopped once at a gas station to collect herself, and once more at the overlook near Chester's Gap where, as a child, she used to play Spot the Mountain with Tommy on long drives with Gran, she'd forgotten what they used to call the peaks, the old, unofficial names they gave each curve of the horizon. Something about seeing those blue-grey ridges again made her breath catch. Now she stood at the door of the house that had once been the world to her, a house filled with ghosts and lavender, with secrets and a woman who had promised never to forget her. She had knocked. Something in her told her not to. The door was unlocked, as it always used to be. The handle turned, the hinges creaked, nothing had changed, and everything had. Hello. Ellie's voice cracked, years of distance crowding her throat. Gran, but the silence that met her wasn't empty. It was watchful. She stepped inside, and the smell hit her, cinnamon and pine, faint hints of old books and sunlight on wood. She reached instinctively for the entryway table, where Gran used to keep her knitting, and a candy jar with peppermints. It was still there. She laughed quietly, disbelieving. Who keeps a candy jar full for a decade? Someone who knew her grandchildren would come back. Gran, she called again. She wasn't ready for the voice that answered. Ellie? She turned. Tommy. He stood in the hallway with the light behind him, taller than she remembered, with the gangly build of a boy caught mid-transition into a man. His eyes are still wide and earnest, locked on hers, and for a moment, neither of them moved. You came too, she whispered. He nodded. I couldn't stay away anymore, he said. They met in the middle of the living room, where they'd once built blanket forts and read fairy tales under quilts stitched by great-grandmothers they'd never met. Ellie pulled him into a hug and clung like he might dissolve again if she let go. How did you know? She asked against his shoulder. Letter, he said. Graduation day. Mailed to my dorm. From her, Ellie pulled back. She sent me one too. They stared at each other, realization blooming like spring crocuses. Gran had planned this. Of course she had. Come on, Tommy said. There's more. They found the first folder in the piano bench. A thick packet labelled, for Ellie and Tommy, when you're ready. Inside were letters, legal documents, family trees, and photographs. The next folder, tucked into the attic under the same blanket chest where Tommy used to hide, contained Sarah's journals and a flash drive. The third, more recent folder sat on the kitchen table like it had been placed there that morning. A legal notice from Margot Finley's office, dated 3 months ago. It was titled, Will's Family Trust Final Activation Documents. Tommy read aloud, his voice low. Per the terms of Karen's Will's last testament and irrevocable trusts, the Wills fam stared, all associated properties, family archives, and inheritance funds shall transfer directly to Ellie Wills and Thomas Wills, to be held jointly in perpetuity, bypassing any other claimants. These provisions override all prior inheritance lines under Vermont's estate law due to the special structure of the trust. He stopped, stunned. Ellie stared at the paper. She left everything to us, Tommy swallowed. She never stopped protecting us. Even when we didn't know, they sat in silence, the weight of it all pressing gently, but undeniably against their chests. It was too much to take in all at once. The inheritance, yes, but more than that, the fact that every year they'd spent wondering if their memories of Gran were over-romanticized. If the life they'd been pulled away from was really as good as they'd remembered, all of it was real. Gran had known. She'd known they would come back, and she'd been waiting. The farmhouse woke up slowly after its long sleep. Ellie found herself wiping the dust from the recipe box that still held her mother's handwriting, the card that read extra vanilla. Tommy says it tastes like hugs. She smiled through tears as she ran her fingers over the words. In the following weeks, they moved in. Not permanently, not yet, but they made the house breathe again. Tommy took over the old sunroom and turned it into a studio. Ellie began cataloguing Gran's records, her letters, the archives she'd so carefully preserved. The drawers, once just old paper, now felt like treasure chests. Maps of legacy, blueprints of love. They contacted Margot, now long retired, but still as sharp and warm as ever. When she heard their voices on the phone, she cried. She never doubted you'd come back, Margot said. Every time someone asked why she kept that place ready for you, she'd say, the roots always know where to grow back. They asked for help setting up a foundation in Gran's name, the Wills Legacy Project, aimed at helping children from fractured families preserve their histories and maintain ties to the people who love them most. It was something Gran had dreamed of doing herself, had scribbled in the margins of her journals, help other families not lose what matters. Ellie dug into the local schools and offered art workshops. Tommy started a storytelling project that let kids write and record their memories for safekeeping. Word spread. The town rallied. Even Donnie McAllister, now the sheriff, came by 2 awful old photos and stories about Kareen's Wills, the woman who saved the heart of this place. Rachel, for a time, tried to fight the trust. She filed a petition through her father's firm, but the courts sided with Gran's airtight documents. When that failed, she sent letters. Angry, self-righteous, and then finally pleading. Ellie never answered. Derek came quietly on a grey morning in early October. Tommy had gone into town, and Ellie was working in the herb garden when she looked up and saw her father standing by the gate. He looked older, gentler, thinner, as if the weight of choices he'd made had been etched into his shoulders. "I didn't know how to come back," he said. "You're here now." They sat on the porch steps like they had when she was little, him with a mug of black coffee, her with a blanket around her knees. "I never stopped loving you too," Derek said. "But I let someone else decide how I should love you, and I can never undo that." Ellie studied him. She wasn't a child anymore. She didn't need to be protected from the truth. And maybe that was what he finally saw when he looked at her. Not a daughter needing answers, but a woman who already had them. "Gran forgave you," Ellie said. "But she didn't forget, and neither should we," he nodded. "Can I visit?" "Help with the garden, maybe," Ellie considered. Then, softly, "Start with the rosemary. It's taking over the whole back row." He smiled for the first time in years. A Ulat Erdemy stood in front of a packed town hall, holding up an old drawing Ellie had made as a child, a crayon rendering of 3 figures holding hands under an apple tree. "This was our safe place," he told the audience. "Our fortress," and Gran was the guard at the gate. Ellie, seated in the front row, watched as children from local schools lined up behind him with their own artwork, their own stories, their own preserved pieces of memory. The Legacy Project had expanded into 3 counties. Donations flowed in from people who had read the story online, touched by the quiet war a grandmother had waged with nothing but patience and faith. Tommy stepped aside as Ellie approached the podium. "We were taken from our grandmother when we were young, told it was for our own good. What we learned, what Gran taught us, is that love doesn't vanish when it's pushed away. It waits, it roots itself, and when the time is right, it returns." A pause. Then she lifted her mother's recipe card, framed behind glass. "This tastes like hugs," she said, "and home." 3 years laterally found the final letter while restoring the attic dot. It was tucked inside the pages of a book called The Keeper of Stories, slipped between chapters like a secret. "My dearests, if you've found this, it means you came back. It means everything I held in trust, my faith, my memory, my fierce love, wasn't for nothing. You are the legacy now. You are the future I fought for. Tell the stories, keep the garden wild, make cookies that taste like hugs. And never let anyone tell you that silence is the same as surrender. Love always, even when the world says don't." Grunelli folded the letter, held it to her heart, and looked out across the field. Spring had come again. The orchard was blooming. Tommy was painting in the sunroom, their father tending the rosemary beds. Children's voices drifted up from a workshop in the barn, laughter threaded with possibility. And in the heart of it all, the house stood. Whole, waiting, and home. Forever. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.